the construction policy products regulation as well. The context of the European construction industry policy is that we have the European Green Deal, first of all, certainly when it comes to sustainability matters. Our President Ursula von der Leyen announced the European Green Deal right at the start of her mandate. The shift from a linear to a circular economy is one of the main planks of that. And what we see that as a business opportunity. So it's not just about environmental sustainability, it's also about an economic change and the business opportunities that come from that. Also, we know that construction has a huge environmental impact. At the EU level, construction demolition waste is the biggest source of waste. It's 37% now of all waste in the EU. And of course, that's only one of the environmental impacts. So this is the overall context of what we're doing. And over the last year or 18 months, we've developed this policy document, the Transition Pathway for Construction. This is construction is one of the 14 industry ecosystems identified in the EU Industrial Strategy. It's the second biggest industry ecosystem. Only retail is bigger, both in employment terms and in economic terms. And what this transition pathway does is it sets out our vision for the green and digital transition of construction, so over the next decade or so, and it also makes some specific recommendations for action either at EU level or at member state level by national governments or by industry themselves. And so it looks right across the green and digital transition and also the resilience of the industry. When it comes to the regulation itself, which is undergoing revision right now, and it's nearing the end of the negotiations now between the Council and the Parliament, it aims to do a number of things. First of all, to improve the single market for construction products. The single market hasn't been functioning as well as it should when it comes to construction products. And then the second major objective is to integrate environmental sustainability aspects into construction products. And through this, we hope to do all these things that you see on the slide, improve the built environment itself, kickstart the circular economy in construction, kickstart the digitalization of construction through the product data, and overall improve the competitiveness and all the other kind of economic and job benefits that we see. The regulation itself has quite a number of different areas that are working on environmental sustainability, which are outlined here. So you can see that there are parts of the regulation that look at product requirements and performance-based requirements, including for standards. There are provisions to do with the manufacturing and the way products are manufactured, the fact that they can be repaired and remanufactured. Also, reuse is now included in there. And then this provision of digital product information that I'm sure you're all familiar with, EPDs and things like that, but this would be harmonized now, and the products themselves, their APDs would be standardized and harmonized through the standard system. There would also be the digital product passport, which would come from a related regulation called Sustainable, the ESPR that you see at the top there, Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. And this is like, if you like, the parent regulation for all consumer products. And the digital product passport is being developed under that. And our construction products regulation sits under that as a, for the particular case of construction products. So the data from the ESPR, from the digital product passport, would come through the CPR, then into other policies, and including legislation at EU level that then implement various different policies. So we have the levels methodology for sustainable buildings, the framework for measurement and reporting against environmental indicators. And that is now referenced in a number of different pieces of legislation at EU level. The taxonomy, which I'll explain in a second, the brand new revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which was agreed only last Friday. And then the other two, the Energy Efficiency Directive as well, believe it or not, has a small part on whole life carbon in there. And then also not only at EU level, but at national level also, this sort of cascade of product data coming from the digital product passport could also make its way into national approaches through national building regulations or public procurement. So the idea is that then we have this consistency of all the information going right through down to the level of individual projects. When it comes to reuse and remanufacture, there's also a number of provisions in the construction products regulation that are outlined here. So you can see that we would permit, for example, a second life to surplus products delivered to the building site. We would have manufacturers giving information on reuse and remanufacturing, dismantling, information on repairability and reuse. All of these requirements would be in there. And then also there are provisions to exempt reused product from certain parts of the regulation, which may not be relevant to reuse. There's this process we're going through with the regulation called the CPR acquis, and this is the process of updating all the legacy information, including all the standards for all these product categories. So the way this is working is that the European Commission gives a mandate to CEN, to the European Committee on Standardization, to update all of these product category standards one by one through this process that's taking about a decade from now. So you can see we've already made a start with precast concrete products, structural metallic products, and the other ones where we're now working on cement and thermal insulation. And then we're working through all of these product categories one by one. The color coding you see there is that the dark blue means that those are not, there's a kind of fast track process that's not applicable to the dark blue ones. And the red ones, apart from that, are the other ones that we are yet to begin. But you can see where we'll next year be starting on structural timber and then going through the rest. That was the construction products regulation, just in a very short a nutshell, but some of the other important pieces of policies at EU level that are just as important in some ways. One of them is the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities. This is aimed at financial institutions and diverting private sector money to sustainable activities. So the taxonomy is essentially a classification system of economic activities and then defining what is sustainable in each of those. And the idea is that investments, such as investments in construction works, would align voluntarily with one of these environmental objectives, and as well as do no significant harm for the other 5. So investors have the choice of aligning their investments with this if they want to call themselves green investments. It's all part of a very large package of financial reforms to do with the European Green Deal. But for construction, by the end of this year, so by the 1st of January, we will have in place the circular economy part of the taxonomy, as well as the climate part, which is already in force. So you see here, there will be a choice from next year for investments in construction. For many of these, they'll be able to choose whether to align with climate mitigation or adaptation or circular economy. They can choose to align with one of them. It doesn't have to be all 3. And then you can see at the bottom half of this table some of these the circular economy criteria that have been developed for construction, not only for the works, so things like acquisition and ownership of building and so on, but also at the bottom there you see for products, there are criteria there for preparing for reuse and end of life and so on, and product as a service. So these are probably worth looking at because they are, quite detailed criteria now that investments would need to align with if they wanted to define themselves as green investments. There's also another important piece of legislation that's going to apply from 2025, the F-gas regulation, which is specifically for foam insulation products. There will be a new obligation in the single market of building owners and contractors to avoid emissions of greenhouse gases from these foam boards and laminated panels when they're being demolished or when buildings are under renovation. And you can see there the cumulative CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas savings are enormous, 180 million tons just from this one policy in the EU by 2050, and an even bigger number globally if this were to be rolled out across the world. So this is another important climate-related regulation. We conduct a lot of studies, of course, in the European Commission. This is one of our recent ones that was looking at measuring the application of circularity in construction. And we wanted to better understand the status quo of the circular economy in construction, and also how companies are measuring the circularity of their own activities. And what we found was only a minority of companies are actually measuring anything. So the study recommended a set of indicators to measure circularity in construction, and it also looked at the drivers and barriers to measurement of circularity indicators. And this is a diagram showing some of these circularity indicators that were recommended. They go around the life cycle, as you can see. Probably the key point here is that the little box on the top right is that these indicators apply at 4 levels of application. So that there are some that apply at product level, some at building or asset level, some at organizational level, and some of them are at urban level. So they're all based on existing standards and methods, and there are also some case studies of these being used in practice already. There's another study we are conducting, which is ongoing, on end of waste criteria. End of waste criteria are defined in the Waste Framework Directive, and so they're effectively the legal definition of when waste ceases to be waste and starts being called a secondary material. And a number of EU member states have end of waste criteria for certain waste streams, particular aggregates. But at EU level, we don't have any end of waste criteria for construction demolition waste. We only have end of waste criteria at EU level for scrap metal and for glass cullet. And the product manufacturers in particular have been asking us to develop end of waste criteria for construction. So this study basically does a background data collection, and we'll end up with a ranked list of recommended waste streams to in future develop these criteria. And we have, this is yet another study, an update to an existing guidance document, in fact, a pair of guidance documents, the management protocol for construction demolition waste and the guidelines for waste audits. As you can see, they're a little bit old now, but they're still quite highly regarded documents. They were written together with industry. We're now revising them. There's going to be a combined new document combining these two together. We're expecting that to be finished next year. And it'll aim to reflect some of these policies that I've just explained, these changes that have happened, and also technical developments since these were published. It'll also, we expect, will address things like asbestos, and maybe also mention post-conflict situations like the rebuilding of Ukraine, and these kind of things will be reflected in here. And that was my last slide. There's just one link there. If you are interested in what we do in the construction unit, there's a link there to our work. And also we have a LinkedIn group where you're welcome to join to learn more about what we do at EU level in the Commission. And thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Philippe. A really useful introduction to the various policies that are being developed at the EU level. We had a couple of questions coming in, so I think we'll do a couple of quick ones now, if you don't mind. So I will try and unmute people if they're available. So Tracy, you had a question. And if you have your microphone ready.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Well, thank you, Philip, for a great, concise, but very informative presentation. I was just wondering what the appetite across the financial sector, let's say in Europe, to put some boundaries for this question, for green investments generally, and if you have ideas of what the growth of that would look like into the future.
Yes, I think one thing I didn't say with the taxonomy is that the whole idea of it is to harmonize, of course. I mean, that's quite often what we try and do in the European Commission. We have currently a situation where, until now, each financial institution can effectively define itself what a green investment is. This is meant to, put some clarity into that. There's I would say there's a big appetite for that, for clarity on what it means. The feedback we've had so far from industry is that it's having a huge effect, this taxonomy, that the product manufacturers and other parts of the construction industry are taking it extremely seriously, and they're looking very closely at these product requirements, the requirements that are written into the taxonomy regulation now. So it is having a big effect. And although it's, as I said, it was a thing that can be applied voluntarily, in practice, some parts of the industry seem to be taking it, more seriously than that, and are really trying to align their investments with it.
Thanks, Philippe. Thank you, Tracy, for your question. We just got one more from Sarah. We'll unmute you, Sarah, if you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I was wondering, has industry essentially paved the way for this kind of legislation, and in what way will it be pushing industry forward?
Yes, I mean, we always consult with industry quite widely on everything we do. The first policy I showed, the transition pathway, this kind of visionary document, was written together with industry, and there was lots of consultation. The regulation itself, of course, is, I mean, in some senses, it's necessary anyway, because the construction products regulation isn't functioning as it should in certain senses. There's a blockage in the standardization process, and there are various other legal problems with it, which need to be rectified by this revision. But on the other hand, also the the transition to a circular economy is a reality now that we're going to live through. It's a train that's been set in motion. So this is part of that this update. So yes, I would say that industry is supportive.
Excellent. Thank you, Philippe. Okay, well, I think we'll save any further questions for the discussion session. So we should have half an hour for questions. So please do keep adding your questions to the Q&A. Right, I will hand over to Katherine and Gilli.
Hello, can you see them okay?
Yes.
And you can hear me okay? Thank you. Always great to hear from Philippe and what the Commission are up to. I think we need to share these slides with our own UK government and get them to do a bit more. So it's going to be a bit of a double act between myself and Gilli Hobbs. We've got quite a lot of slides, so we're just going to go through them quite quickly, but we hope we give you a bit of a flavour of some of the work that's going on, both in the UK and in some the European countries that we work with, and we are looking at taking you through the whole building life cycle, if you like. So just to quickly note, I've got two hats. I'm with ASBP and Reusefully. Gilli's just got one hat with Reusefully, but we do lots of work on circularity. That's why we're here today. So this is a diagram we developed quite a while ago, actually, in the BAMP project. Many of you have probably heard of that project. It was one of the first ones that really sort of did quite a deep dive into circularity and material passports and all those sorts of things. But it's really very much looking at you know, all the different considerations across buildings' lifetime, and in fact this is sort of over a building's lifetime again and again. So very much looking at the building as material banks concept, the urban mining, what we can use in our buildings now, how that can then go into our new buildings, but then making sure our new buildings also become that mine of materials in the future, and that's really important in the way that they're designed and the materials that are used. So they're designing for circularity piece, and underpinning all of that is circular business models, procurement, and data and indicators. So we'll try and touch upon all of that today in some elements. So this is the study that Philippe mentioned. So we were lucky enough to work with him and his team and Deloitte in terms of generating a whole load of indicators. So I think Philippe said there was about 19 shortlisted. We had about 40, I think. And if you look at the report, which I really recommend you do, because there's lots of useful information in there, you can see all the sort of different levels of indicators. I'm not going to go through all of them because that's an event in itself, really. But what we tried to do here is look at the different sort of levels in terms of products, buildings, organizational and urban level, and trying to choose indicators that already had some sort of elements of measurement within industry, all connected through to other information sources, for example, such as EPDs and that sort of thing. We often work with organizations that just want one circularity metric, sort of an aggregated indicator. But this just shows you that, you know, for circularity, it's more about just the mass of materials going in and out. There's lots of other sort of design considerations as well. So if anyone has got a really clever aggregated indicator, please share it. So these are the ones that you can see we developed at a sort of a product level, as you would expect. Some of them are quantifiable, some of them are just sort of a yes, no as well. So more of an enabler type indicator. There's a whole load at the building level or asset level. This is also relevant very much for infrastructure as well. Really broken down at what you can do at the design stage, and we'll pick up a few of these as we go. And then also what is happening at the operational stage and then at end of life stage. So you can see why there's quite a lot of indicators shortlisted, because you're trying to cover all different life cycle stages, different stakeholders, and then at these sort of different 4 levels as well. And we have organizational ones. So these are very much if you have, if you're a portfolio holder of assets and, you know, you want to start sort of benchmarking performance across the whole company, if you're working on lots of different projects as well. And some of these don't necessarily fit into traditional sort of waste resource efficiency indicators, if you like. For example, looking at service life and financial data. There's also an urban level, but I won't go into that. And this very, don't worry, you don't need to, I won't spend long on this slide, but this just sort of shows all the interconnectedness between the data that's collected at these different levels and how it can all feed in together. So I just wanted to raise that because, you know, there's always a lot of talk on indicators. So hopefully some of the work that we did there can sort of, you know, put people in the right direction. So what we want to talk about now is the building as material banks, that urban mining, and looking at some of the elements which has been going on existing assets. So in the UK, there's quite a drive actually for this, particularly coming from London, where we have a London plan which requires a circular economy statement for larger developments. And this really, this requires 2 reports to be undertaken as part of planning. First of all, a pre-redevelopment audit, as in, can you retain the asset and the justification for demolition? And you're seeing quite a lot of London boroughs really pushing for this now, and some are even sort of starting to go for a retrofit first policy. So if you are looking at demolishing, you really have to provide a very sort of valid reason for that, which is more than just sort of financial gain or income from increasing your net area, for example. Once demolition's decided, or a certain amount of refurbishment, then it's very much looking at undertaking a pre-demolition audit. And I know there's different examples of this across the member states as well. And that is really trying to sort of focus on getting the best value of materials that you can. A lot of products are already recovered, but a lot are downcycled. So it's really trying to maximise that value as much as possible. This is a project Gilli worked in London, which really sort of tried to quantify this sort of retention versus demolition scenario, and trying to encapsulate different types of information to have a real sort of solid triple bottom line assessment of retention versus demolition as well. So it's really looking at, you know, what's the demolition costs, how much would that cost in terms of demolition, management of the site, if you kept on letting it out, what is the revenue, what is the number of jobs, and really giving that sort of thorough assessment, which, you know, I don't think that happens as much as it should, unfortunately. So with pre-demolition audits, if we just drill down onto them, they're not a new thing. This is UK experience. The first one was undertaken nearly 20 years ago at BRE. But we are seeing an increase in them, but whether it be through sustainable assessment schemes such as BREEAM or clients or planning requirements. And it's very much trying to move waste up a value retention hierarchy. But again, and not for discussion today, but it's looking at sort of interlinking that with the whole life carbon assessments and that sort of thing. And they're very much more maturing in the space that we're working in anyway, from going from a sort of a simple inventory, if you like, to really sort of providing an in-depth resource passport tracker and then linking through to marketplaces. But to do that, you need a lot of time and information to do that. And what we see always when we do a lot of these pre-demolition audits is a lot of the material is usually concrete. You can see an example of all the different beams there. Some reuse is, you know, we look at all the different materials, but concrete always dominates tonnage-wise. And it's really, really hard to get sort of the higher value recycling and reuse out of concrete. But we are starting to see that for sort of more and more elements. So from the audits that we do, and we do quite a few, we've learned quite a few lessons. Needs to be quicker. People need information in different ways. So if you're looking at reusing products and materials in the new design or new elements of the refurbishment, you really need a good level of information in terms of what that product is, the meter squared, how it fits in the new design, if it's facade, that sort of thing. But if you're putting information on a marketplace, or you've decided the best option is for recycling by a demolition contractor, you may need a whole load of different information. So that's quite important, that transfer of information there. In the UK as well, and that we've very much been successful in the reclaimed steel arena. So we've got a few stockholders have entered that. There's a really good protocol that allows products to be RE-CE marked, if marked. So it's again, how do you work out what steel's more suitable for reuse as well? We're looking very much at procurement, because things fall down quite a lot at the procurement stage, especially when it comes to the demolition contractor. So how do you allow for sort of better reuse and recycling within that as well? And I know there's lots of different examples of this across Europe, but again, a project Gilli worked on was looking at how you then turn this building into a bank of materials and then advertise them as such on this materials exchange, which I think is about to be developed or launched for across London. And you can see sort of the type of information that's needed to be able to allow that materials be reused and recycled, and just the amount of time needed, you know, to get this on platforms as soon as possible is just really important. So I think pre-demolition audits are getting quite well established, but it's very much sort of looking at taking that to the next level and trying to actually implement some of the findings. It can be quite difficult because a lot of buildings aren't designed for disassembly and deconstruction. It's looking at how they link with all the whole carbon agenda as well, and also find out what happens in terms of the recommendations, and learning from what we do and what we know in terms of which products and materials are difficult to recover or reuse. And that may be because of the way they're put in, and translate those findings back into sort of better design next time. So there's quite a lot of, I don't want to be too UK centric, so there's quite a lot of useful information out there. Do Google some of this if you're really interested. I just found out about this the other day, but there's a really good standard on sustainable refurbishment, which talks about the ability, you know, justification for refurbishment if you're undertaking it, why is that sustainable, for example, and then what to do when it comes to demolition and pre-demolition audits and those sorts of things. And this is a mix really of projects, and you're actually getting some standards and that sort of thing as well. This is a case study that you can see in that indicator report that we did, which is legislation in France called PEMD. I'm sure it's got a name, after calling it PEMD, which is requiring pre-demolition audits for buildings over 1,000 meters squared. So quite big, but I suspect that will come down in time. And by having legislation in place, they've basically been able to standardize the information that's put in, which is really great, and also develop a platform so the information can feed in. So you really, at this stage, you really are starting to generate that whole building as material banks by aggregating all the information up. And that really helps sort of providing confidence with the supply chain in terms of reuse and recycled materials. And I'm now going to pass over to Gilli, because she is the standards lady. Are you okay there, Gilli?
Yeah. I may have to, because I've got quite a nasty cold, so Catherine's going to step in if my voice gives out completely or I have a coughing fit. But it seems to be okay at the minute. So yeah, so my other hat is, as well as Reusefully, is I do quite a lot of work with the standards. There is a European committee linked to TC 350, which is Sustainability Construction Works, and then Subcommittee 1, which is Circular Economy in the construction sector. So it's been going for about 2.5 years, and there's a working group 1 that is quite well underway in terms of developing the framework and definitions, which is much needed in circular economy for construction. And then working group 2, which was I was more involved in, was looking at gap analysis and recommendations for further work items. So what are the priorities for further standardization? Next slide, please. Katherine. So after doing the gap analysis, there were a set of recommendations were produced, and the most recent development is that there are now 5 task groups that have been set up to consider standardization needs on these 5 different aspects. So probably not a massive surprise, and there's quite a big alignment activity that needs to happen, obviously, with the work that's happening, with the work that Philippe outlined earlier. So there's the whole circularity data aspects, so the products, materials, the building, passports, logbooks. Then sort of quite heavily linked to that is then undertaking those circularity assessments. So how do you measure performance by way of circularity? And it could be environmental, it could be social, it could be different environmental indicators, etc. So that's the second task group. The third task group is looking at the pre-demolition and pre-development audits and evaluation. And the fourth one is focused on the reuse of construction products and materials. And then the fifth one is much more looking into the future. So how do we sort of, what are the sort of elements of designing for circularity at these different levels of construction? Next slide, please. So that sort of like takes across existing buildings into the sort of current and the future built environment. And then this section is really just thinking, okay, you know, what are the considerations at the sort of design and construction stage? So particularly looking at making use of these the assets that are coming out of the existing built environment. So there's a bank of materials, we need to put them into end uses. And then there's also quite a lot of issues in relation to particularly the refurbishment stages. And then finally looking at the sort of product data and selection aspects. So next slide, please. So just to sort of make it, and I Philippe referenced this, so levels is a very good sort of overarching sustainability approach that considers different themes across sustainability. And I think it's just really important to sort of recognise that circularity and particularly some of the very specific things we talk about in relation to circularity need to be sort of set against this broader context. So I think that's the sort of, you know, the starting point, and then optimising the circularity aspects within that. Next slide, please. And actually, there's also some very good case studies that are emerging. So these are construction projects that are completing now, where, you know, they basically started their journey probably 2 or 3 years ago. So we're starting to see some very good information coming out to suggest not only can you actually implement these things, you can provide, these are the recipients of the products and materials that are coming out of demolition and refurbishments. So it's not just only happening, there's also some quite cost savings and significant carbon savings that can be associated with these really good case studies that are emerging. So we definitely need more of these to happen. We definitely need to be very transparent in terms of what's worked well, what didn't work so well, so we can continue to overcome some of these barriers that are very evident when you try to deviate from business as usual. Next slide, please. And we're finding that refurbishment and fit out, so obviously there's quite a lot of waste associated with demolition and construction, but actually, particularly as we're seeing things like the retro first objectives coming into planning and other regulations, there's going to be a lot more refurbishment. There's already a huge amount of refurbishment. And we see in particular things like the fit out from commercial buildings. There can be a lot of resources that aren't optimized as part of that process. I'm trying to be polite here, but you know, sometimes, for example, so this is a study that FIS they focus on fit out in the UK. They've undertaken. And they come across some quite horrifying case studies where, you know, offices have been fitted out, so Cat A fit out, which is basically to advertise space, and then when that space has been let, everything's been ripped out, so lights, flooring, etc. So they haven't even been used. So there's quite potentially quite a wasteful process, but also a big opportunity to make better use of those products and materials, particularly as we accelerate the amount of refurbishment that's going on. And I think the key thing is to move from the situation now where everything's sort of treated quite separately at the top to the situation where we can actually have more circular approaches But in order to do that, we do need the stuff in the middle, which is to have this improved transparency, speed of information that's being transferred from the sort of donor strip out projects to the recipient projects, having that exchange of materials and products. But there's a lot of logistics that need to be organized as well. So this is a big focus of FIS, is to try to smooth out some of those bumps in the road, particularly linked to the transport and storage. And then we're also starting to see that there's much more supplier responsibility coming into the mix. So, we're seeing that some of these suppliers are actually starting to be much more interested in taking back their products and materials for remanufacture, or to at least put back in as feedstock. Next slide, please. And this is just one of the projects that we're involved in to try to accelerate that connection between what's available and matching that to the end users. So this is Link project, so it's an Innovate UK project, basically trying to link the sort of photograph recognition. Okay, I can identify that ceiling tile is a certain type of ceiling tile. Now I can put it onto an exchange platform very quickly without having to like spend a lot of time and effort to find information to put in with that that announcement. So it's making it much slicker, much quicker. Next slide, please. And here's just another case study that's just focusing on the product level and how we are starting to see some of these schemes emerging to really focus on what's the circularity at that product level. So this is another French example, eco-scale scheme, where they've developed effectively a grading from, I think it's from A to E or A to F, of these different aspects of circularity. So recycled renewable material, demountability, reusability, and recyclability. So essentially, I think it's about 17 different indicators altogether are going into these 4 sort of higher level assessments of circularity to give a much more intuitive way of recognizing whether products are going to be, contribute more to the circularity of a building project or not, essentially. Next slide, please. And then sort of looking to the future, though, some of the things I've talked about, obviously crossing into that, but particularly focusing on things like design for circularity and continuing that producer responsibility. So from this point forward, so things like extended producer responsibility. So more future proofing. So try not to repeat the same mistakes, but then also thinking about, we want these products and materials to be as accessible as possible at the highest value possible. If they're going to be coming out in 5 years or in 10 years or 15 years, depending on what layer it is in the asset, or what the sort of future use phase, what happens in that use phase. It may not be fit for that purpose anymore, so it may need to be changed more, within a shorter time period than was originally planned at the design phase. So this future proofing is really important as well, to sort of build that into the built environment now. Next slide, please. And there's an ISO standard 28887 designed for disassembly adaptability. I think it's been around for 3 years. So effectively, there's a set of adaptability principles. So versatility, convertibility, and expandability. So lots of abilities, but they're all sort of operating at different levels. So the first one being sort of being able to do that within the same day, and the third one could be, quite a significant change of use into the future. So those are the adaptability principles. And then next slide, please. The disassembly principles, there's quite a few more of these. And so the picture I've got here is from the Green Transformable Building Lab in Heerlen, which demonstrates quite a few of these different principles. I won't go through all of them, but some of the key ones are like avoiding unnecessary finishes. And I think we're seeing that more and more, where we've got like just bare concrete or nice polished floors, rather than putting other flooring finishes that are glued on, you know, so avoiding those finishes can be quite good for future reuse, for example. Easy access is definitely a really important one, is not only having that easy access components and services, but also it being quite evident how to get to those, and so linked to these principles was also quite a lot of information on making sure that data is captured and transferred across the asset life cycle, you know, to the point of actually having a deconstruction plan that would effectively articulate the reverse construction for certain elements in the building, for example. Next slide, please. And then just I think just to finish up a bit, talking about extended producer responsibility. So we do have, there's actually not that many examples of extended producer responsibility as a mandate, as a legal requirement in the construction sector. There's quite a few more that are either voluntary or very specific product groups. So probably the one that's been around the longest is the Vinyl, so the PVC scheme that's been, so it's must have had its 20-year anniversary this year. And I think that's been quite effective. So things like the window frames, the flooring, pipes, etc. There's effectively the collection and recycling of those products have been subsidized for decades. And then again, the French seem to be quite into sorting out materials from the construction demolition processes at the moment. So there's another extended producer responsibility regulation that came out this year, which effectively is making a requirement to contribute to waste recovery of those suppliers of construction products and materials that are available on the French market. So that's quite an all-encompassing EPR scheme. There's some very specific ones. So in the Netherlands, they have one for flat glass, for example. And what's going to be quite interesting, as Philippe presented, is the CPR revision, whether or not that's going to sort of then lead into requirements for extended producer responsibility. It'll be quite interesting to see the detail of that. Next slide, please. And then just finishing up on the circular business models, which I think we've alluded to, but there are quite a few of these that are here and more emerging. So particularly keen at the supply take back and remanufacture, because obviously they're in a quite good position to offer that sort of extended connection to their products and materials, and then provide this closed loop back into their processes, or to remanufacture and resell. Oh, dog. So there are some examples. I'm going to let Katherine speak over from here. Sorry.
Oh, hello everyone. Good job I was listening. Yeah, so I think in the UK we're especially seeing I think the thing with take back and remanufacture is what we've been doing with manufacturers, and a lot of other people have, is just keep on asking them if they've got a take back scheme, and then eventually I think they'll probably have to think, oh, we're going to have to do something about this. And where we've seen uptake the most is probably in the shorter lived products, so partitions, ceiling tiles, carpets. Not all manufacturers are doing it, but you know, there's some leading manufacturers that are starting to investigate it, but also they're not, you know, they can be quite difficult to set up as well, because we were talking to one ceiling tile manufacturer who did have a take back scheme, but then had to stop it, largely because they had, you know, it was too successful. They had too many tiles come back to them, and their products could only take a certain amount of recycled content. So in that case, it's sort of, you know, it's trying to understand how these products can be used, and in what format as well. Gilli, are you back? Do you want to do leasing? It's up to you.
Yeah, I'm back. Oh, yeah, I don't know if it's a postman or something. So leasing. So again, I think everybody knows about the lighting, paper, lux, but there are some other schemes. So the picture top right is the TU Delft looking at facade leasing. that's actually starting to be commercialized now, the facade leasing. And then also things like lifts. So I think that's going to continue, but it hasn't. I think it's been around as a concept for quite a few years, and there are obviously some difficulties associated with particularly longer lived products and services, having that sort of leasing, the changing from, you know, for the traditional procurement to a more of a leasing service agreement. But obviously that does lend itself very well to remanufacture, repair, and getting products and materials back to then support future product development and manufacture. And then I think because there is this gap in terms of the suppliers being able to offer take back for all of their products, and also actually sometimes it's very difficult to work out who supplied it. I think Katherine probably is with me on that. You know, we're going around doing these audits. It's quite often it's just impossible to know who's actually supplied the product. So we're starting to see these third-party remanufacturers or resuppliers that are taking things like raised access flooring. It's a very sort of standard product. So there's now actually a bit of a shortage. So that, you know, because the embodied carbon associated with reusing certain products like raised access flooring and steel, etc., is quite good, then there's a bit of a sort of demand for them. So these third-party suppliers are focusing just on, for example, resupplying reused raised access flooring. To a lesser extent, some of the heating and cooling systems, but that's still possible. There's still quite a good potential to remanufacture plant equipment, particularly newer stuff. May not be in the same country, but that is happening. And then lighting, and the example down in the bottom corner is about the Reusefully, which is basically where lighting suppliers actually sort of now taking back fixtures and then remanufacturing lighting from those. So that's becoming much more prevalent as well. So yeah, there's lots of really good things happening, more to go at obviously, but yeah, thanks for listening, and I think we're here to get questions now.
Excellent, thank you, Gilli. Thank you, Katherine. Yes, you certainly are here to get questions. We have a couple. So I might just add in one of our colleagues, Katherine, Debbie, who is leading our Reuse Now campaign, just to perhaps get involved here. So one of the questions was, I think it was only published last month, but has anyone reviewed the Waterman Group's framework for material passports?
We've seen it. Can you hear me, Richard?
We can.
Yeah. So we've seen it. We know it's there, and I know that we've been having conversations with Rachel Houlihan at Orms and Anna Costa at University of Lancaster, who the Circularity Waterman's author had been discussing passports with them, I know as well. So there's quite a lot of activity around passports at the moment, and that segues nicely into the link that you just put in the chat. We've got a couple of webinars because the ASBP, we've got a campaign at the moment, the Reuse Now campaign, which is looking at the reuse of products and materials, lots of different products and materials, obviously, with all the work we've done around Disrupt with steel reuse, but moving on into other products and material streams as well, potentially looking at doing some deep dives into aluminium and glass, particularly around partitioning, and maybe touching on facades as well, as one of the next things we're looking at. But equally part of us trying to encourage reuse across the industry, obviously with our members, but much broader as well, is organising interesting webinars. So we've got one actually on Thursday about on Q, there you go, Richard again, on digital hubs, and then the material passports one on February the 1st. Both of them are free to attend, so please check out those. But also a call for any interesting reuse case studies, because we really are trying to just get as much useful information on the Reuse Now web pages as possible. So any other interesting reports or case studies or links would be gratefully received. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Debbie. Anything to add there?
No, I think Anastasia from Circuland's on the webinar actually. So I have to admit I have not read the report in detail. I don't know if Gilli has.
We're too ill. Otherwise, I would have, obviously.
Anastasia, are you there? Anything to add to the discussion? If you have a microphone. Oh, perhaps not. Can you speak, Anastasia? Not to worry. Sorry, we put you on the spot.
She is presenting on the event on the 1st, so.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait.
I think what's also interesting is I flagged up those task groups at the EU level, the SEN level. So some people may think if you're in the UK it's not relevant. Well, actually, British standards still align with EN standards at the moment. So the idea is to sort of harmonise various activities, and that first task group is very much looking at you know, the things like the product passports, the building passports. So there's the fact that there are these existing schemes and protocols, etc., is obviously very useful, because then they can feed into those sorts of standardization activities to get a consensus. And it wouldn't mean that everything was the same. It would just mean that some of the basics would be harmonized to enable multiple schemes to operate, but essentially they could still be compatible with each other.
Okay, yes, that's key. Okay, there's one more question. It's Tracy again. Thank you, Tracy. I'll allow you to speak.
Hi again. Thanks for sharing that case study by the FIS on fit outs. It's really alarming every time, you know, in practice that you hear cases of things being just thrown out. And having lived in New York, I also see so often so many, you know, brand new couches and furniture just left on streets. So I wonder, are there also discussions often discussions on how owners and the consumers, so the end users and the purchasers of these materials, should share more responsibility for reuse and minimizing waste? And I know that, for example, with ESG reporting, that's one potential mechanism to put a bit more of the cost of excess into financial context. That's not necessarily fully baked yet, but that I can see that as being one mechanism. But I just wonder if that's something that's also being discussed in any way in these topics.
Yeah, I think it's a bit FIS work in the commercial world, and I think it's quite mixed actually, very much dependent on your tenants. So some of the tenants are really pushing the building owners and related to their ESG reporting, and you know, saying that they really want sustainable office fit outs, and there's more and more examples where they're looking at, you know, reclaimed and recycled materials and keeping what's there. And I think there's also quite a big move towards green leases. I don't know how useful they actually are in practice though, but a lot of it comes down to the procurement and what's within their lease, isn't it? And if they have to take back the accommodation to what it was when they moved in, that's the main barrier. But then I do think you've got a whole load of tenants who just want the best. You know, look at it, you know, look their fit outs to look the best, and not necessarily so in line with sustainability. So a bit of a mix, I think, still.
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, there's some, you know, I think that the sort of expectation of particularly like the high-end offices I think that's actually leading to quite a lot of waste being produced. So I think there's definitely there's probably a way of educating or raising awareness to say, well, actually, some of these elements, you know, they need to perform technically. It doesn't really matter what they look like. So raised access flooring, you're going to put a carpet on top of it, or something's going to go on top of it. If it's been reused and it's not as shiny as new raised access flooring, doesn't make any difference to the performance of that material, of that product. So I definitely think there's you know, there needs to be a lot more done to sort of make the link between, actually, it might not look perfect, but it doesn't need to look perfect, it just needs to perform in this way, and these are the benefits that have been derived by, you know, by taking this product from another commercial building, for example, and putting it here. I mean, there are some financial savings, but they're not as, you know, I think they're not the thing that's driving this process. It tends to be the sort of ESG and the client requirements that's driving it. But again, yeah, there's a lot of education and awareness that is needed to make that, you know, that link much stronger, and then it will become much more commonplace.
Okay, thank you, Gilli. Okay, we have another question from Sarah. I'll unmute you again.
Hi, I just wondered if anyone knew, and I know you're not dealing with legislation in the same way as the last speaker, but do you know what teeth the legislation will have in terms of getting people in line, basically?
Which legislation? The EU legislation, or
upcoming UK or EU legislation? Again, this is probably a question for the previous speaker more, but
okay,
it occurred to me now.
Is Philippe still there?
Are you there, Philippe?
Yes, I'm here, but can you repeat the question?
I was wondering what incentives stroke disincentives stroke teeth the legislation you were talking about would have.
The construction products regulation.
Yeah.
And incentives for what?
Well, really, I'm thinking about what is going to make people. Is this going to be fines? Is this going to be, you know, what level of if you see what I mean?
Well, the basis of the regulation is a rule. There are conditions for putting a product on the market. So a product that doesn't meet the criteria of the regulation won't be able to be put on the single market. So they're not fines as such. It's just access to the market. And of course, that means that, you know, because it's a product regulation, it's, you know, it's only affecting, you know, there's only so much it can do. There are lots of other things we need to do for circularity, of course, other than just at the product level.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I could comment. What I guess what you're seeing more in the UK, because we haven't got so much legislation apart from waste, like end of pipe legislation, is much more being interacted through planning, especially in London, and that's quite interesting. I was at a workshop the other week actually, and how far can they actually sort of push this, push sort of retrofit first, reuse, recycling through the planning agenda, and then trying to balance that with sort of all the economic and social objectives as well. So I think at the moment the main element is putting processes in place to make sure that people are looking at it and putting in circular economy strategies and that sort of thing, but it's not necessarily being driven by targets as such. I don't think. It's more showing sort of the thinking behind it and applying those principles to projects.
Thank you, Katherine. So if anybody does have any more questions, please add them to the Q&A or raise your hand. I had a question for maybe all the speakers. So in the ASBP, around half of our members are manufacturers, many of them SMEs. Do you have any tips or guidance for how they can sort of stay ahead of the curve in terms of the CPR are there any working groups they can join, or where can they sort of stay in the loop? I suppose I could see it could be a bit overwhelming for some of them, all these different regulations that we're talking about. Katherine, Philippe?
I'm going to hand that over to Philippe.
Yes, I'm going to put a link in the chat.
Okay.
There is a way. We hold a series of events called the High Level Construction Forum, which is our main way of having a regular dialogue with the industry. And that is, all the EU associations of product manufacturers take part in it. Plus, there are member state authorities that take part, or they're basically online events. Also researchers, all kinds of people. There are about 800 people or more signed up to this high-level construction forum. Sorry, I'm just trying to find here it is. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Philippe. And there was a follow-on question from our colleague at natureplus, Tillman. Tillman, I'll let you ask it yourself.
Yeah, hi, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect, nice. Yeah, hi, thank you so much for to the speakers. Wow, it was very dense, a lot of knowledge, very great, and yeah, it's really lesson learned again. So that's very great. We had already some events within this series about the CPR, the construction product regulation, and yeah, I think we really had some learning. So I really would like to motivate manufacturers and all others active in the field of sustainable construction to get active in these Attendees working groups. So I think, Philippe, if I'm not mistaken, this is really a possibility to get active and to introduce knowledge. My question also would be a little bit what Richard just asked. So an impression we had was that it might be very difficult for small manufacturers to fulfill, well, let's say to make the calculation necessary for the CPR when it comes to environmental performance, when this calculation has to be built on EPD. So there was yeah, let's call it fear, well, a little bit big word maybe, but there was the fear of the small manufacturers that EPD might be obligatory. Is this planned within the CPR? And are there methods to help small manufacturers, because, well, it's really like cost intense to have an EPD for each product?
Yes. Basically, yes, it will become mandatory to have an EPD once those harmonized standards are in place, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's a process going to take quite a while. But that is the idea, that you will have mandatory data. Now, we'll have to wait and see the outcome of the negotiation. The Commission had proposed mandatory carbon footprint data and then all the other environmental indicators being optional. But the European Parliament tabled an amendment to have more indicators mandatory. So we'll have to see, whether that is accepted by the member states and the Council.
Okay, I see. So these mandatory calculations of footprint could be EPD, but it's not a must that it's the EPD. But well, it's a very
well. I mean, they will be, yeah, they will be digital product data, so effectively EPDs, yes. And then that's what we want to see, is that every product going on the market eventually has digital data. But as I said, even after the regulation is agreed and adopted, there will need to be secondary legislation doing things like defining the digital product passport in detail and some of these things. So it is going to take, when it's not happening tomorrow, a couple of years away before this really becomes, a real requirement that people will have to comply with.
Okay, thank you. Richard, may I make one comment?
Yes, of course.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So what I really think it's a good approach. Also, this is into direction of Philippe, that you make it material-wise open, so that you don't want to, well, specifically say this is the right material, that your material open. Still, I would like to underline, out of our experience, like natureplus Ecolabel, we are also certifying products that we made very good experience with bio-based and mineral-based raw materials, so products that are based out of these materials. And yeah, we really had some, like in the series, we really had some very nice examples that it works very well, and that also circularity and bio-based, very often it is seen separately, but it actually it's also a match. It really works together. We had one event of it, was in the Triodos Bank in the Netherlands, and it's a wood construction building what is absolutely dismantleable. Like you can really take the things apart. So it really works, and yeah, this just as a very good learning, like this two things, bio-based and circularity, also goes very nicely together. Okay, thank you very much really to the speakers again and ASBP to holding this. Can
I just make a comment about EPDs? And obviously I recognise the importance of EPDs and having a harmonised standard to do, you know, life cycle assessment. But having an EPD does not in itself make something a low impact product. And I think it's really important to just, you know, not lose sight of that. And like particularly like SMEs, manufacturers of alternative products, material systems. I think the important thing is to understand, you know, how are you reduce what's being done. We're talking about circularity here, but it's not just circularity. There's obviously, you know, other issues of sustainability that are important. But just thinking about circularity, you know, I showed the eco scale thing, which showed 4 different aspects of circularity, and then there are 17 different indicators or attributes that sit underneath that. So, you know, and as Philippe said, we're on the train's running, but it's quite a slow train, so you're not going to have to necessarily be at that, you know, have an EPD next week or anything. So in the meantime, it's probably quite important to get the products and system as circular as possible, and look at, you know, what can be done to improve things like designing for future reuse, etc., increasing reused or recycled content, providing this extended service agreements or leasing agreements with customers. And I think those are all the things that, you know, any company or any organization can start to think about and start to do now. And actually, there's more and more customers that will want that sort of service provided, that will want to see evidence that you're actually doing something a bit different to business as usual. It's not just the same products and okay, it's got an EPD, but actually there's nothing to demonstrate that anything's been actively done to improve its circularity. So I think EPDs are a way of measuring performance, but they're not the way that you're actually going to improve that performance. That takes, you know, that's a different set of tasks and objectives that needs to be undertaken.
Yeah, I mean, but what I can say to that, you're right, Gilli, is that there's also a need to increase demand for, you know, sustainable products. And of course, as you know, a product is only sustainable if it's put together with other products in a way that makes the whole building sustainable. So one of the things is the whole life carbon calculation. And we heard only last Friday there was an agreement on the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So, I mean, it hasn't been written in the press yet, but we know that the whole life carbon calculation is part of that agreement. So we are going to have mandatory whole life carbon assessments for new buildings at EU level. And that, you know, of course, then creates a demand for low impact, or at least from the greenhouse gas perspective, low impact buildings, and possibly drive down at the product level as well, you know, the pressure on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is quite an important, you know, but again, measuring whole life carbon, I mean, and then linking it to, so there are some countries that obviously then have threshold levels for whole life carbon per meter squared. And that can be a really big driver for things like reuse, because if you're reusing stuff, then the embodied carbon is normally going to be a lot less than getting new equivalents in. So you know, we need to have these measurement systems, we need to harmonize the measurement systems, but then we also need to sort of have targets that are linked to driving down these impacts that actually encourage these markets. And I think that will then help the SMEs, because they'll see the business opportunity to then do things like the whole life carbon, the EPDs, because they can demonstrate they perform better.
Thank you, Gilli. Couple more questions coming in. Just so if you are an SME manufacturer and you wanted to improve the circularity of your products, is there a resource you would recommend they looked at? Are your circularity indicators publicly available yet? Or?
Yeah, I think the slides are being circulated, aren't they? So there's linked to the report. There's some quite interesting case studies as well of what's happened more at a national level or regional level.
Okay. Thank you. And a final question, I'll ask it on behalf of Sarah. You're saying we're moving quite slowly. Is there room to speed things up, or do we just have to go through the process and wait till the legislations come into effect? I guess so.
Well, I don't know, I could just say from the UK perspective, I think as Katherine said, there's planning drivers, but there's also some very big client drivers. So things are being accelerated in the private sector through clients showing their sort of ESG credentials effectively.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the construction products regulation is a relatively slow process because it has to go through the full, you know, especially when it comes to updating the standards, that has to be done very carefully, of course, and very technical work. But as Gilli said, there's nothing stopping other levels of government, right down to local government, taking the action that they can take, like through procurement and through planning and things like that. So you don't necessarily have to wait for, you know, the top level to take action.
Excellent. Anything to add, Katherine?
Well, just I think it's important to use schemes such as Levels, DGNB, BREEAM, the France HQE, that, you know, they do have elements of circularity. Some of them are really well defined, but DGNB and Levels have got really good sort of adaptability and deconstruction type calculators in them. So a lot of the thinking's already been done. You know, it's time to get on with it, really.
Well, on that statement, I think we'll come to a close. So thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Gilli, for your contributions, and thank you all for joining us. I think this is the last event in a series, but we'll send the link to the natureplus event series, and you can find out more information. And yes, we have an event coming up on Thursday. We've sent the link in the chat, so please do join us if you can. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.